The Shining. In the heart of the Colorado Rockies, surrounded by snow-capped peaks, stood the Overlook Hotel, a grand monument to a bygone era. It was a place of opulence and elegance, but it held a dark secret. For years, the hotel had been the site of tragedy and violence, and the spirits of the past lingered within its walls. Jack Torrance, a struggling writer and recovering alcoholic, saw an opportunity in the hotel's off-season closure. He accepted the position of winter caretaker, hoping the isolation would provide him with the peace and quiet he needed to finish his novel. Despite warnings from the hotel's cook, Dick Halloran, about the hotel's dark history, Jack moved his family into the Overlook. His wife, Wendy, was hopeful that this change would bring their fractured family closer together. Their son, Danny, was different. He had a gift or a curse, depending on how you looked at it. Danny had the shining, psychic ability that allowed him to see things others couldn't. As the days grew shorter and the snow began to fall, the Torrance family settled into their new home. But the Overlook Hotel was far from empty. It was alive with the echoes of its past, and it wasn't long before those echoes began to seep into the present. Danny's psychic abilities began to manifest themselves in terrifying visions. He saw the ghosts of the hotel's dark history, the twin girls who had been murdered by their father, the woman in room 237 who had taken her own life, and the sinister presence in the hotel's maze-like hedge garden. Meanwhile, Jack's mental state began to deteriorate. He became increasingly obsessed with the hotel's history, spending hours poring over old newspapers and documents in the hotel's archives. The isolation and the influence of the hotel's malevolent spirits began to take their toll on him. As the winter dragged on, the hotel's dark influence grew stronger. Jack became more and more unhinged, and Danny's visions became more and more frequent. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, feeding off the fear and suffering of its inhabitants. In the end, it was Danny who saved them. Using his psychic abilities, he was able to outwit his father and escape from the hotel before it consumed them all. As they drove away from the Overlook, they looked back one last time at the dark, imposing building, knowing that they had narrowly escaped with their lives. But the Overlook Hotel was not done with them yet. Its dark influence would follow them wherever they went, a shadow that would haunt them for the rest of their days. Hereditary. The Graham family seemed like any other family in their quiet, suburban neighborhood. Annie was a talented miniatures artist. Her husband, Steve, was a supportive and caring husband, and their children, Peter and Charlie, seemed like typical teenagers. But beneath the surface, dark secrets lurked, waiting to be uncovered. Annie had a troubled relationship with her mother, Ellen, who had recently passed away. Despite their estrangement, Annie was deeply affected by her mother's death. She found herself haunted by memories of Ellen, memories that seemed to blur the line between reality and nightmare. As Annie delved deeper into her family's history, she discovered that her mother had been involved in dark and sinister rituals, and that the Graham family was not as ordinary as it seemed. Ellen had been a member of a cult that worshipped a malevolent deity known as Paimon, and now it seemed that Paimon's influence was reaching out from beyond the grave. Strange and inexplicable events began to occur in the Graham household. Annie's miniatures seemed to take on a life of their own, depicting scenes of death and despair. Peter and Charlie began to exhibit disturbing behavior, and Annie herself started to lose her grip on reality. As the dark forces at work in the Graham household grew stronger, the family found themselves in a battle for their very souls. Annie, Steve, Peter, and Charlie were drawn deeper and deeper into the web of darkness that surrounded them, until they could no longer tell where reality ended and nightmare began. In the end, the Graham family was torn apart by the malevolent forces that had taken hold of them. Annie, driven mad by grief and guilt, took her own life, while Steve was brutally murdered by their possessed children. Peter and Charlie, now fully under the control of Paimon, carried out the cult's dark rituals, preparing the way for Paimon's return to the mortal world. As the flames consumed the Graham household, a dark figure watched from the shadows, his malevolent laughter echoing through the night. Paimon had returned and nothing would ever be the same again. Get Out. Chris Washington, a young African-American photographer, was invited by his white girlfriend, Rose Armitage, to meet her parents at their secluded estate in the countryside. Despite his apprehensions, Chris agrees to the weekend getaway, hoping to impress Rose's family and smooth over any potential racial tensions. As they arrive at the Armitage estate, Chris is struck by the awkwardness of the situation. Rose's parents, Dean and Missy, seem overly eager to welcome him into their home, but there is something off-putting about their demeanor. Chris is also disturbed by the behavior of the Armitage's black servants, who seem strangely subdued and robotic. As the weekend progresses, Chris becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Strange and inexplicable things begin to happen around the estate, and Chris starts to suspect that there is more to the Armitage family than meets the eye. His suspicions are confirmed when he discovers a secret underground laboratory where Dean has been conducting bizarre medical experiments. Chris learns that the Armitages have been luring young black men to their estate in order to transplant the brains of elderly white people into their bodies, effectively achieving immortality. Horrified by this revelation, Chris realizes that he must escape from the estate before he becomes the next victim. With the help of another captive, a man named Andre Hayworth, whose body has been taken over by an older white man, Chris fights his way out of the estate and confronts the Armitage family. In a climactic showdown, Chris manages to outwit his captors and set fire to the estate, destroying the laboratory and putting an end to the Armitage's twisted experiments once and for all. As Chris drives away from the burning wreckage of the Armitage estate, he is haunted by the horrors he has witnessed. He knows that he will never be the same again, but he is determined to put the past behind him and move on with his life. Little does he know, the nightmare is far from over, and the Armitage's legacy will continue to haunt him for years to come. The Exorcist. In the quiet suburbs of Washington, D.C., a darkness was growing. Chris McNeil, a successful actress, had recently moved into a new home with her daughter Reagan. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon strange and terrifying things began to happen. Reagan, once a happy and outgoing child, started to exhibit bizarre behavior. She became withdrawn and sullen, and her once bright eyes grew dark and hollow. Chris was worried sick about her daughter, but no matter how many doctors and specialists she took Reagan to see, no one could explain what was happening to her. As Reagan's behavior grew more and more erratic, Chris became desperate for answers. In her desperation, she turned to Father Damien Karras, a Jesuit priest and psychiatrist, for help. At first, Father Karras was skeptical of Chris's claims of demonic possession, but as he witnessed Reagan's increasingly violent outbursts, he began to suspect that there was more to her condition than met the eye. With the help of another priest, Father Lancaster Marin, Father Karras began the harrowing process of exorcising the demon that had taken hold of Reagan's soul. But the demon was powerful, and it fought back with all its might, using Reagan's body as its vessel. As the exorcism grew more intense, Father Karras found himself wrestling with his own faith and doubts. He had always believed in the power of science and reason, but faced with the undeniable evidence of evil before him, he began to question everything he thought he knew. In a final desperate bid to save Reagan's soul, Father Karras sacrificed himself, allowing the demon to take possession of his body instead. With his last ounce of strength, he flung himself out of Reagan's bedroom window and fell to his death on the steps below. In the end, it was Reagan's love for her mother that saved her. As she watched Father Karras's lifeless body being carried away, she reached out to Chris with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Mommy, I'm scared." With those words, the demon was vanquished, and Reagan was finally free. But the horror was far from over. As Chris and Reagan embraced each other, battered but alive, they knew that they would never be the same again. The darkness that had touched their lives would always be a part of them, a shadow that would haunt them for the rest of their days. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Springwood was a quiet suburban town, but it held a dark secret. For years, the residents of Springwood had lived in fear of Freddy Krueger, a vicious child killer who had been burned alive by an angry mob of parents. But Freddy's reign of terror was far from over. In death, he had become something far more terrifying. A vengeful spirit who could invade people's dreams and kill them in their sleep. Nancy Thompson was a typical teenager, living in Springwood. She had friends, she had a boyfriend, and she had dreams of her own. But when her friends began to die in their sleep, Nancy realized that Freddy Krueger was back, and he was more powerful than ever. Determined to stop Freddy once and for all, Nancy delved into the dark history of Springwood, uncovering long-buried secrets and confronting the sins of the past. With the help of her boyfriend Glenn and her friend Tina's boyfriend Rod, Nancy discovered that Freddy could be defeated if they could pull him out of the dream world and into the real one. But Freddy was not so easily defeated. As Nancy and her friends struggled to stay awake, Freddy picked them off one by one, tormenting them with their worst fears and deepest insecurities. With each death, Freddy grew stronger, feeding off the fear and suffering of his victims. In a final desperate bid to stop Freddy, Nancy confronted him in the dream world, using her own fears against him. With the power of her mind, Nancy was able to banish Freddy back to the depths of hell, but not before he delivered one final chilling warning that he would always be waiting in the shadows, ready to strike again when they least expected it. As the sun rose over Springwood, Nancy emerged victorious, but forever changed by her ordeal. She knew that Freddy would never truly be gone, that he would always be lurking in the darkest corners of their dreams, waiting for the chance to strike again.